Jimi's last big concert. 3 weeks later, he was dead. What he said on stage haunts everyone. August 30th, 1970, Isle of Wight, England. A small island off the southern coast, barely 23 miles long, suddenly hosting the largest music festival ever held in Britain up to that time. 600,000 people had descended on this tiny island, overwhelming its infrastructure, its roads, its resources. The festival had been running for 5 days already, since Wednesday, and by Sunday night, it had transformed from a celebration into an ordeal. Beautiful, muddy, exhausted chaos. People were tired beyond measure, hungry, dealing with terrible sanitation and almost no facilities. The organizers were completely overwhelmed by the scale. Security was struggling to maintain any kind of order. The peaceful vibe that had defined Woodstock a year earlier was absent here. This felt tense, frayed, like something that could break at any moment. Jimi Hendrix was scheduled to close the entire festival. It was supposed to be a triumphant return to Britain, the country that had first embraced him back in 1966 when America still didn't know his name. Britain had made him a star. British fans had understood him first. This performance was meant to be a thank you, a homecoming, a celebration. But by August 1970, everything had changed. Jimi was exhausted in ways that went far beyond physical tiredness. The constant touring, year after year without real breaks, city after city, stage after stage until they all blurred together. The business pressures, managers fighting over him, contracts he didn't understand, money disappearing while everyone around him got rich. The musical direction disputes with his band, wanting to go one way while everyone expected him to stay another. The lawsuits, old contracts coming back to haunt him, people claiming ownership of his music, his image, his soul. The expectations, be Monterey Jimi, be Woodstock Jimi, be the wild man, be the guitar god, never stop. All of it was crushing him under a weight that would have broken most people months or years earlier.
He'd recently formed a new band. The original Jimi Hendrix Experience had broken up earlier that year. Noel Redding was gone, even Mitch Mitchell was in and out. Jimi was trying to find his sound again, trying to figure out what came next. But nothing felt right. He was 27 years old and already felt ancient, used up, depleted. The days leading up to Isle of Wight were difficult. Jimi was staying in London, dealing with management issues, money problems, personal relationship drama. He wasn't sleeping well. Friends who saw him said he seemed sad, disconnected, like he was going through the motions of being Jimi Hendrix rather than actually being him. On the day of the performance, Jimi arrived at the festival site in the early evening. He was supposed to go on around midnight, but as always with festivals, the schedule was running late, very late. By the time Jimi actually took the stage, it was 2 a.m. on Monday morning, August 31st. The crowd that had been 600,000 during the day had thinned considerably. Maybe 200,000 remained. Many had left, exhausted after 5 days. But 200,000 people was still an enormous audience, still more than most artists would ever play to. Jimi walked on stage, looking tired. He wore a light blue jacket with orange lining, bell-bottom pants, a headband. His Stratocaster hung from his shoulder. Behind him, Billy Cox on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums. They looked as exhausted as Jimi felt. The crowd cheered, but there was a weariness to it. Everyone was tired. It had been a long festival. Too long, really. The magic and peace and music vibe had worn thin days ago. Now it was just people in a muddy field at 2 a.m., cold and ready to go home, but staying because this was Jimi Hendrix. Jimi stepped to the microphone. Usually, he'd just start playing, but this time he spoke first.
"This is our last gig," he said quietly. The crowd stirred. What did he mean? Last gig of the tour? Last gig before taking a break? Last gig ever? Nobody knew. "We've been traveling around quite a bit. Jimmy continued, his voice soft, almost melancholic. "It's been a long time. We'd just like to play some songs for you, if that's okay." There was something in his tone, something final, something that made people in the front rows look at each other with concern. Then Jimmy started playing. The opening song was powerful but controlled, not the wild explosiveness of Monterey or Woodstock. This was different, more introspective, more careful, like someone who was tired of breaking things and just wanted to create something beautiful before leaving. About 3 songs in, technical problems started. Jimmy's guitar kept going out of tune. The sound system was struggling. At one point, he had to stop mid-song to fix the tuning. The crowd grew restless. Some shouted for him to hurry up. The energy was off. Jimmy looked out at the massive crowd in the darkness and spoke again. "We're having some technical difficulties. I'm sorry. We're doing our best." He sounded defeated. This was supposed to be triumphant. Instead, it felt like struggle. But then something shifted. About halfway through the set, after fighting with the equipment and the sound and his own exhaustion, Jimmy seemed to let go of trying to make it perfect and just started playing from his soul. He stopped trying to be what people expected and just became what he was in that moment, a tired, sad, brilliant artist who needed to say something before it was too late. He played a version of a song that was slower, more haunting, more emotionally raw than anyone had ever heard him play it before. The tempo dragged, like someone walking through mud, like someone carrying impossible weight. Every note was given space, given time to resonate, given permission to hurt.
The guitar cried, literally cried. Not the aggressive wail of his earlier years, but something gentler and more devastating. The notes bent and wailed and moaned with a sadness that was palpable, even across 200,000 people spread across a dark field with terrible festival sound systems. Jimmy's face showed pain that the cameras captured and that people in the front rows would never forget. Not physical pain, but something deeper, older, more fundamental. Soul pain. The pain of someone who was carrying more than any human being should have to carry, and who knew he couldn't carry it much longer. People in the crowd who had been restless, who had been wanting him to play the hits louder and faster, suddenly went quiet. They were witnessing something profound. This wasn't entertainment. This was witnessing an artist at the end of his rope, playing like it might be the last time. Because it would be. Near the end of the set, Jimmy played an instrumental piece that he'd been working on. It was spacey, experimental, not the hard rock people expected. Some people didn't get it. Some got bored and left. But the people who stayed, who really listened, heard something extraordinary. They heard goodbye. The final song was a cover, a song Jimmy had been playing since his early days, but the way he played it that night was different, slower, more deliberate, every note given space to breathe, to mean something. It sounded like a benediction, a blessing, a farewell. When the last note faded, Jimmy stood for a moment, looking out at the crowd. The sun was beginning to rise. Dawn was breaking over the Isle of Wight. 200,000 tired, muddy, moved people stood in the early morning light. Jimmy unplugged his guitar, set it down gently, so gently, not smashing it like Monterey, not burning it, just setting it down like you'd put a baby in a crib, and walked off stage. He didn't wave, didn't bow, just walked off into the sunrise.
Backstage, people who talked to Jimmy said he seemed relieved it was over, but also sad. "That was hard," he told someone. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." "Doing what?" they asked. "All of it," Jimmy said. "Being who everyone wants me to be." The reviews of the Isle of Wight performance were mixed. Some critics said he was off his game, that the technical problems ruined it, that it wasn't the explosive Jimmy they wanted to see. They didn't understand they'd witnessed something more important than explosiveness. They'd witnessed vulnerability, truth, an artist at his limit. Jimmy left the Isle of Wight and returned to London. He had some time before his next commitments. He was supposed to record, supposed to tour more, supposed to keep being Jimi Hendrix. But he was tired.
So tired. 18 days later, on September 18, 1970, at the Samarkand Hotel in London, Jimi Hendrix died. He was 27 years old. The official cause was listed as asphyxiation from vomit while intoxicated with barbiturates. The details were murky, contradictory, changed depending on who was telling the story. Accidental overdose, the official reports said. Suicide, some people whispered, pointing to his depression, his exhaustion, his talk of wanting to escape. Murder, conspiracy theorists claimed, suggesting his management or others who stood to profit from his death. The truth died with him in that London hotel room, and 40 years of investigation and speculation never brought it back. When news of his death broke on September 18, people who had been at Isle of Wight suddenly understood with devastating clarity what they'd witnessed 18 days earlier. That wasn't just a concert that happened to be his last. That was goodbye. Deliberate goodbye. When Jimi had said, "This is our last gig," with that particular tone, that particular sadness, he might not have known exactly what he meant on a conscious level, but some deeper part of him knew. Some part of him that could see just a little bit into the future was already saying farewell, was already preparing to leave, was already done.
The slow, sad songs that some critics had complained about, "Where's the fire? Where's the explosiveness?" suddenly made perfect sense. The gentle, almost tender way he'd set down his guitar at the end instead of smashing it or burning it or celebrating with it, that made sense too. The dawn breaking over the Isle of Wight as he walked off stage for the last time, how could it have been anything other than symbolic? All of it took on new, prophetic, heartbreaking meaning. A photographer who was backstage at Isle of Wight, who'd photographed dozens of Jimi's performances over the years, said years later, "I saw him after the show, sitting alone on a road case while the crew packed up equipment around him. The sun was coming up, and he was just sitting there, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who just finished something important and was ready to rest, deeply, profoundly ready. I took one photo of him in that moment, just sitting there with the dawn light on his face, and then put my camera down because it felt wrong to document whatever he was going through. I didn't know then it would be eternal rest, but I think some part of me understood I was looking at an ending." Billy Cox, the bass player, who'd been with Jimi through so much of that final year, later said in interviews, "Jimi was different at Isle of Wight. Quieter than I'd ever seen him, more internal, more withdrawn. We'd been playing together for a while, and I knew his moods, knew his ups and downs, but that night felt final in a way I couldn't articulate until after he died. Then it made horrible, perfect sense. He was saying goodbye, and we didn't have the ears to hear it." A fan who was in the front row, who'd traveled from Germany specifically to see Jimi, remembered decades later, "When Jimi said, 'This is our last gig,' my friend next to me joked, 'Yeah, right, until the next tour starts in October.' We both laughed, but I felt a chill run through me, something in the way Jimi said it, something in his eyes when he looked out at us, like he was telling us goodbye, and we were too dumb or too young or too unprepared to really hear it. After he died, that moment haunted me for years, still does. I heard the goodbye. I just didn't believe it was possible." The bootleg recordings of Isle of Wight became some of the most treasured and most traded among serious Jimi fans and collectors. Not because the performance was perfect, it absolutely wasn't. It was messy and plagued with problems. Not because the sound quality was good. It was terrible, muddy, distant, missing frequencies. But because it was the last time, the last big stage. The last time 200,000 people, or even 600,000 if you count everyone who was there earlier in the day, got to be in the presence of genius while it was still breathing, still creating, still here. The last dawn Jimi Hendrix would ever see from a stage, with the sun coming up and his guitar in his hands and people listening.
In the years after his death, Isle of Wight took on mythic status. It became the concert where Jimi said goodbye, where he gave the world one last gift: vulnerability instead of explosiveness, soul instead of spectacle, truth instead of entertainment. Music critics who'd panned the show later recanted. "I didn't understand what I was witnessing," one wrote. "I wanted Monterey Jimi. I wanted Woodstock Jimi. I got something rarer and more precious, honest Jimi, exhausted Jimi, human Jimi, and I was too caught up in expectations to appreciate it until it was too late." The Isle of Wight Festival continued for a few more years, then stopped until the 2000s. But everyone who was there in 1970 had the same story. They didn't talk about the other acts. They didn't talk about the mud or the chaos or the organizational problems. They talked about Jimi, about the 2 a.m. set, about the sunrise, about the moment they didn't know was goodbye. "This is our last gig." 4 words that haunted everyone who heard them. 4 words that meant more than anyone understood at the time. 4 words that became Jimi's epitaph before he even had one. Isle of Wight, August 30–31, 1970. The last big concert, the final dawn, the goodbye nobody wanted to hear. If this story of endings and prophetic moments moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the most important performances aren't the loudest or most perfect, but the most honest. Have you ever witnessed a last moment without knowing it was a last moment? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more stories of the moments that defined and ended eras.